I began the presentation of the sufficiently general theory of governance with the entire function of governance, with its presentation. The entire function of governance includes several successive stages. It all starts with the detection of a problem that puts pressure on the psyche and necessitates governance. This is followed by the formation of the skill for the recognition of this problem. The next stage is setting of objectives in relation to the problem, the formation of the conception of governance in relation to the problem, and the integration of it into the general conception according to which governance is carried out in relation to other problems, implementation of the conception in life, monitoring the functioning of those systems that carry this conception, that implement governance, and, upon achieving the objectives, either freeing up resources or maintaining the structures connected with the problem in a functionally operable state. Something can be detailed, something can be reduced. Nonetheless, there is always the beginning and completion of the entire function of governance. And then the question arises, all this was in words, and what image understandings connect lexicon with life? It turns out that the picture for the sufficiently general theory of governance and its connections with life is the method of dynamic programming, and those pictures on the basis of which it is usually discussed and presented to people. I will not delve into the details and formalism of the method of dynamic programming. I will mainly talk about its essence. In order for the method of dynamic programming to work, it is required that the task can be represented as a sequence of a certain number of steps. It is also required that with each state, it would be possible to connect a certain evaluation of the quality of the state, and that it would be possible to construct an evaluation of the transition from one state to another. And at the same time, the structure of the task should not change with the changing of the number of steps during which it must be solved. There is one more restriction. For the choice of subsequent governance at each step, the prehistory of the question should not exert an influence. Purely formally, this restriction is circumvented by the fact that the position at any point of the trajectory can be considered, if it's conditioned by the prehistory, as a certain plurality. That is, in the plurality, each seemingly identical position, if we talk about the characteristics in the position itself, is supplemented by the prehistory of the question, which is considered as one of the parameters of the task of governance, and then it can be analyzed. This picture usually illustrates the method of dynamic programming. Zero position is the starting position, and then a plurality of trajectories leading into a plurality of final positions, plurality 3. In the squares, there are evaluations for each of the final states, and along the trajectory of the transition, there are evaluations of each of the transitions. That is, if you go along different ways from the starting point to any of the final ones, then Each trajectory can be compared with a certain cumulative gain, which is an evaluation of the final position, plus the sum of the step-by-step gain on each trajectory. And accordingly, the method of dynamic programming is a formal instrument for optimizing decisions of various kinds of tasks of governance, which can be reduced to the algorithmics of the method of dynamic programming.
которые могут быть сведены к алгоритмике метода динамического программирования.
The important thing here is that it's not some particular decision that is optimized, but the entire process of governance, the process of transition from what really is to what is desirable for us in the final variant upon completion of the process. And now here's another picture, variations on the method of dynamic programming. It is also a mnemonic scheme for representing the sufficiently general theory of governance in the form of images. There is also a certain plurality of starting stages and numbered pluralities to which the final results and interim results of processes of governance belong. How is this picture different from what is presented in the first picture? That picture is simply a diagram that illustrates the algorithmics of the method of dynamic programming with which everyone can acquaint themselves in the corresponding literature. Either the materials of the conception of social safety, where the sufficiently general theory of governance is laid out, or in the materials for such a course as operations research, where mathematical models are collected that are used for optimization of various processes of governance in the course of solving governorial tasks. In principle, such a picture is an analog of a matrix in which processes of governance flow. In other words, there is a sequence of a plurality of possible states that can be occupied by an object of governance, and there are possible paths of transition that connect these states. Furthermore, in this picture, all the pluralities are ordered according to the quality of governance. Here is the scale of quality of governance. The quality of governance is lower the further from the abscissa axis. The highest quality of governance when the object is on the abscissa axis. Accordingly, the inverse scale is the current error of governance. And if the process is multi-parametric, that is, we have not one error of governance, but a vector of error, in which there can be a plurality of parameters, then how can we correlate this vector with this picture? And the answer will be simple. Here we have a scale for evaluating the quality of governance. That is, we have already transformed the vector of error of governance, as it is, multidimensional, into an evaluation of the quality of governance by some one number, which is a function of the positions that can be occupied by the object of governance. Now let's see. Here we have object A and object B. And if we consider the whole plurality of trajectories along which these objects can move, then, in fact, in the starting position, the probability of getting into an ideal position is closed for none of the objects. The position which is characterized in the picture, the fifth plurality, 0.5:3.
Это если говорить об объективных возможностях.
if we talk about the objective probabilities. But governance is always subjective.
Если, допустим, субъект
And if, for example, the subject does not see the ways of transition from the starting point to the final position in the objective matrix,
то он оказывается перед
then he is faced with a situation where governance is objectively possible, but for him, it is subjectively inaccessible.
И дальше получается так, что
And then it turns out that the probabilities of implementing governance in such a scheme presuppose knowledge of at least one trajectory that leads from the starting state to the desired final state. As I said last time, the final state in the overwhelming majority of cases is a certain mode in the encompassing process into which our particular governed process must fall. And before starting a process, we must be convinced that it will end with an acceptable for us completion, which will belong to an acceptable encompassing process or to some other process that continues ours. Remember how perestroika began, when one of the deputies said that the Soviet Union was like an airplane that took off from an airfield, and at which airfield it will land, no one knows. And what in this respect is new? Klyuchevsky also wrote, "Do not start an endeavour, the completion of which is not in your hands." To put it differently, the completion, this is a process that a particular process must enter, and the governance towards this encompassing process into which we are supposed to fall must be in advance acceptable to us. Because if the particular process is not to miss the Titanic, then there will be a great deal of troubles. If we simply reason on the theme of this picture, then situations are possible when the subject, one or the other, does not see any paths in this picture, in the matrix of possible states, and therefore he cannot use them. In this case, he may go along some other path. But in order to carry out the process of governance, in addition to open possibilities, one must also have certain resources. And if, for example, the passage along a trajectory is connected with various energy expenditures, and the energy potential is such that we can go along some trajectories, but we can't go along other trajectories because we don't have enough energy to overcome them, then it also turns out that of all the open multitude of possibilities, some turn out to be closed for us. And then such variants are possible that the passage along some routes requires more time, the passage along others less time. And it turns out that if we talk about the optimization of processes, then, in the overwhelming majority of cases, optimization occurs according to one of two parameters: the shortest time for the achievement of the objectives, or the minimum resource consumption with the achievement of objectives within the time that it will take. And one more variant: restrictions are imposed on time. That is, it should not exceed a certain maximum, upon reaching which the objectives already lose their relevance. And within this maximum, the consumption of some resources is optimized within the limits of all this. Further, if we, after all, have some idea of the entire trajectory of the passage, and it comes to the practice of governance, then there are two variants. We successfully pass through all the stages. If we are subject A, we are leading object A, then for us, the best trajectory in which the highest quality of governance is achieved is the trajectory that is the closest to the abscissa axis. And the area between the trajectory and the abscissa axis is to some extent an evaluation of the quality of governance. But, after all, there are variants that we don't cope with the governance at some stage. And by strength of this, the variant which for us is desirable, for example, here variant 0.3:3, turns out to be unachievable for us due to transitional errors occurring at the stage from the second plurality into the third one. And the variants may be different, because if we slide from variant 2:2 to variant 3:2, then for us the possibility is still open, the possibility to go to the final, desirable for us variant through two trajectories, either through 4:4 or through 4:3. But if we have slid into variant 3:1, then the objective matrix is such that within 5 steps we will not manage to reach the desired for us position, and for us there remains an open possibility only to get either to variant 5:2 or variant 5:1. Further, there begin interesting things connected with the method of dynamic programming. The reality is such that if you can load the governorial task that you are going to solve into the algorithmics of the method of dynamic programming, then this is one of the criteria of the fact that you have set the governorial task correctly. I emphasize only one of the criteria, because the method of dynamic programming is a method of formal optimization, in some way a formalized task. If you have successfully formalized the task, then if it fits into the method of dynamic programming, then this is one of the criteria for the correctness of its formulation. Why? Because the method of dynamic programming does not work when the final objectives are not determined, when there is no determination in the question of at least one single trajectory that leads from the starting position to the final one, and when your control parameters are metrologically inconsistent, by force of which you cannot evaluate the quality of each of the positions on the trajectory and are not able to evaluate the trajectory. And if you look, then quite a lot of arguments on the theme of solving applied tasks of governance avoid determination in questions of what the objectives of governance are, how to distinguish the useful return of the system, its useful output signal, from the inherent noise of the system, and external interference, which, in some way, passed through the enclosed system and expressed themselves in its outgoing signal, or in what we call the system's return. And if you set the task correctly, if you have an idea of at least one trajectory that leads from the starting position to the final position, if you are provided with the resources necessary for governance, then, further, there arises a very peculiar paradox. It turns out that in the matrix of probabilities there is no fundamental difference for a governor between the present and the chosen future.
и избранным будущим.
And then begin questions that connect the theory of governance with a certain mysticism.
Теории управления с некой мистикой.
Because the matrix of probabilities, in the triunity of matter, information, and measure, is an empty matrix. That is, these are only probabilities that can be filled with matter and information. And in order for something to be realized, this matrix must be filled with matter in one form or another. And this process can hardly be instantaneous, that is, in the form of some kind of leap. This process usually spans a period of time. And then, in order to understand many questions of governance, you have to turn to fairy tales and folk wisdom. Almost everyone knows the plot of the fairy tale Sleeping Beauty. A girl, a princess, is born. The king arranges a ball. The fairies come. The fairies give gifts to the princess, expressing these or those wishes that are meant to be fulfilled in the future. But to the ball, they have forgotten to invite the evil old woman, Caraboss, or they did not wish to invite her. She shows up, but the fairy of spring, knowing her malignant character, hides, and she is not yet visible. And the old woman, Caraboss, decides to sum up all the wishes expressed by the other fairies, and says that when the princess is 16 years old, she will prick her finger on a spindle and die. At this time, the fairy of spring appears and continues. Yes, she will prick her finger on a spindle, but she will not die. She will fall asleep, and in 100 years a prince will wake her, and then they will live happily ever after. What's really going on? You see, thought is material. From the point of view of physics, a word is a kind of oscillation. And Klyuchev's words come to mind. It's not given us to foretell how our words will echo through the ages. That is, how the world would respond to the emitted by us oscillations. And if it's not given us to foretell how our words will echo through the ages, then, thanks even to that physics that we know after school and university, it is clear that the world is a combination of all possible kinds of oscillations, emissions, re-emissions, the objects of which have reached some flows of emissions and oscillations, including re-emissions into other frequency ranges. If, for example, there are several strings, and these are, say, La of different octaves, then if you touch one, then the others also respond. In other words, the reality is such that the assumption that the word can govern the flow of events in the world around us simply by virtue of physics does not contradict modern physics. It's another matter, have we mastered the skill or not? Or otherwise, who has mastered it at least to some extent, and who has not? If we correlate with this, it turns out that the old woman Karabas, staying at point 2, emitted a wish to bring the process down here. The fairy of spring appears and says, "No, this here will not be. It will be like this here, and the process will not go along this trajectory, but the process will go along this one, and then it will go there." From the point of view of physics, it looks like the old woman Karabas put all her energy resources into the wishes, and, accordingly, energetically pumped up this branch of the matrix. And when the fairy of spring comes out, the old woman Karabas really has no energy resources left. She needs some time to replenish the energy in order that she could do something else, and that her words would not be empty. And the fairy of spring draws a bottom line on the programming of the life of the princess in one of many ways. And, with her energy reserves, she reformats this step from the second to the third plurality, and, as a result, the fairy tale acquires a happy ending. Now let's look at such a thing. That in almost all cultures, in all aspects that relate to the conduct of conversations and disputes, the question of who will have the last word plays an important role. Why? Because, since ancient times, in cultures, it has been known that there are some statistics of the interconnections between the last word and what will actually happen in life. Because the reality is that indeed the word governs the flow of events, and thought also governs the flow of events. And since we are talking about the governance towards particular processes, the discussions, in one way or another, come down to what kind of particular process will have what content, and how it should be completed. It turns out that the one who says the last word and pronounces it in the right mood, then he determines the point of completion of the particular process. Will there be this ideal, or will there be that ideal? But then it turns out that if you refer to this picture, then here there is a vector of objectives, there is a vector of error, a subtraction sign, and an equal sign. If we correlate with this formula, then it turns out that the vector of objectives and the vector of error of governance are reversible, because what from the point of view of one subject of governance can be an objective of governance, from the point of view of another subject of governance, it can be an error of governance. If there is such a conflict of setting of objectives, then two subjects will never be able to agree as long as they adhere to mutually exclusive objectives. And the compromise that can be between them cannot be a compromise that is oriented towards exhausting the conflict of governances. A compromise between them can only be a compromise in order to play for time, and close some probabilities of action for the opponent in order to collect some of his resources during this time, and then, in relation to the opponent, to execute actions unacceptable for his governance. By virtue of the fact that a society is a plurality of people, and in the matrix, there are also paths of development of this society. Well, how do we relate to this matrix? To the processes or its energetic content? To the choice in it of these or those paths? The reality is such that most people don't even ponder on it. Although they don't ponder on it, nonetheless, they have different thoughts wandering around in their heads. Well, it's one thing if thoughts wander by themselves, but the fact is that a person can be in two different states of his biofield. In one state, the biofield is enclosed on itself, and in such a state, a person can really think different thoughts, but these thoughts cannot harm or benefit anyone, because all this remains inside him, in his biofield. And if he is only emotionally inflated, then, in this state, he can bring himself either to a heart attack or to a stroke, or cause activation of oncological processes or something else that is localized in his organism and can harm him. And if he is in a different mood, when his biofield, by some of its fragments, areas, is enclosed on his organism, on his psyche, in informational algorithmic regards, and by its other fragments, it's enclosed on the surrounding world, including on the field bodies of egregors, with which certain people are in one way or another connected. What will happen then? And then, if every thought is likened to a domino, then we are dealing with a table on which dominoes are scattered. They are not empty dominoes. There is a certain symbolics, which is the image of the metric of state in the matrix. And each domino is a certain personification of a step, a transition into this matrix from one state to another. And since there is a certain magnetism, in the end it turns out that one says one thing, another says another thing, a third one says something else. As a result, an energetically saturated algorithm of a certain process takes shape in the noosphere. In fact, no one seems to want anything. When the fragment of the matrix is energetically saturated, the process of self-realization begins. What will happen in the end? In the overwhelming majority of cases, nothing good. Either a stock market panic or a Maidan. The only difference is that there are guys who purpose-orientedly engage in such things as this, as a result of which the social element works in an automatic mode. But the objectives when it starts to work, and the moments when it starts to work, they turn out to be under the governance of other people. One of the tasks is the timely discharge of all manner of matrices which someone deliberately, or out of foolishness, pumped up with all manner of evil. Because the reality is such that in order to create something, it's necessary to possess certain knowledge, skills, self-discipline, self-mastery. But in order to bring forth a catastrophe, this requires nothing more than abidance in the incorrect emotion-meaning structure and the enclosure of the fields, not on oneself, but on the surrounding world. And this is the answer to the question, why do so many people constantly complain of weakness, insufficiency of energy? Because if with those thoughts that are inherent to them, they would have a quite sufficient amount of energy power, then they would become generators of many troubles that are not realized only because they are energetically weak and do not have the energy power that can fill the matrix of catastrophes. Well, with the reversibility of the vector of objectives and the vector of error of governance, there is also another factor in the life of society which is characterized by the words to invite disaster. That is, the reality is such that yes, some kind of disaster is possible, but at the same time, the matrix that leads to the realization of this disaster is empty. And if you keep quiet about this, then there will be no disaster. And if you start to stir up fears connected with this disaster in society, then willless and meaningless emotional people will pump up this matrix with energy, and the disaster will begin to self-realize. Many have noticed that in a number of cases, when they announced their intentions for the future, even in the circle of close people, they failed to realize these intentions, or they managed to realize them with great difficulty. Behind these things stands the fact that if we assume that there exists a certain measure of the governance qualifications, then, in order for something to be realized, the qualifications of the governor must be inversely proportional to the probability of the self-realization of this event. That is, if the probability of the self-realization of this event is 1, then the qualifications of the governor can be 0. The lower the probability of the self-realization of the event, the higher the qualifications of the governor should be. By itself, the term probability, in the sense that it's used in probability theory and in mathematical statistics, is incorrect. Why? Because in the Russian language, the word probability, вероятность, has the same root with the word vera, faith and belief. Неверие, disbelief. Недоверие, distrust. Доверие, trust, is a whole complex of one-rooted words that is connected with ethics. Therefore, the very name of the branch of mathematics, probability theory, is already an incorrect name, because the correct name would be mathematical theory of measures of non-determinations, Because what the theory of probability calls probabilities, in actual fact, are, after all, not probabilities if you understand the ethical aspects of everything connected with belief. These are evaluations of the measures of the non-determinedness of the self-realization of some events, which are obtained on the basis of these or those models that give these or those outcomes for those events that are considered by this or that model in the theory of so-called probability. And the probability appears exactly as the work of the evaluation of the measure of non-determinedness of the self-realization of events and the qualifications of the governor, who undertakes the implementation of this event of one of the plurality, the self-realization of which, speaking the language of the theory of so-called probability, are different. And thus it turns out that the mathematical theory of measures of non-determinateness of self-realization of events is only one of the instruments serving governance, which always carries a subjective character, and in which there always, in one way or another, participates a personality who can transform low evaluations of self-realization of events on the basis of some objective laws into high probabilities of their realization.
Оценки самореализации событий на основе каких-то объективных закономерностей.
And then it turns out that in the process of working out of decisions, many can participate, but responsibility for the implementation of a governorial decision can only be sole personal.
Ответственность за реализацию управленческого решения может быть только единолично персональной.
When we, without thinking, announce our intentions, then we actually deny the principle of sole personal responsibility for the implementation of governorial decisions. And the wrong, egregorial algorithmics of governance towards processes comes into play. Why? Because while you are silent about your intentions, you act only with those egregors to which you are personally enclosed. If you share information about your intentions through a word, then those with whom you have shared have, in fact, provided informational leakage to other egregors, the algorithmics of which may conflict with the algorithmics of those egregors on the basis of which your intentions are supposed to be realized. This is one variant. And the second variant, a channel takes shape through which the energy you previously pumped into the transitional matrix on the basis of that which really is, by the time of the realization of your intentions, simply flowed into other egregors, and what you want is not realized because there is no energy. But there is an opinion that everything I said is fiction, prejudice, superstition, and so on and so forth. But for those for whom mysticism is a part of reality, for those, what I have said now is an explanation of some of the questions with which they somehow have had to deal. And it turns out that intentions can be discussed only with those who will knowingly provide support in their implementation, including mental support, that is, by thought, by word, by egregorial matrix governance. And those who are interested simply because they have curiosity and have nothing to do, but they would like to learn something, chat about something, and so on, then in these situations, it's better to remain silent about your intentions. Now about the implementations of intentions. In one of the books, maybe it's the book named The Secret Fairway, mention was made about a fact, the reliability of which I cannot say anything, but it makes sense. Once the item of lucky, unlucky was present in the description of the officers of the British Navy. Maybe they still use it. In the light of the foregoing, the presence of this item is justified, because entrusting the execution of a responsible military operation to a person out of whose hands everything spills, and who is pursued by troubles, including those seemingly not conditioned personally by him, is to endanger both the participants in the operation and those who depend on the successful outcome of this operation. That is, if you don't wave away mysticism, but find mysticism in life, see its place in life, and understand that mysticism is connected with subjectivism and the qualifications of a governor, which begins here, in the ability to see the entire trajectory and objective, and to ensure the protection of the passage along the trajectory from the impact of other subjects on the same object, then everything is fine. There is a book called Primitive Culture. It was written by Edward Bernard Tylor. This is an English ethnographer who did not belong to any school of ethnography, for the simple reason that he himself was a school. I mean that he did not belong to a specific professional community and was not bound by its logic. Therefore, Tylor wrote a really interesting book about primitive culture, from which you can understand much which is useful for modern life. In his book, he writes about the Algonquin Indians. They had such, not a custom, since a custom is still something episodic, but they had such a component in the culture. When teenagers were asked to start fasting, to withdraw from the tribe, and after that, to tell someone close about those dreams that they saw. Further, these dreams were correlated with reality, and the whole plurality of teenagers were divided into two categories: those whose dreams did not have any continuation in the future, and those in whose dreams the future was displayed in some images, symbols. After that, those teenagers in whose dreams the future found a certain reflection underwent corresponding professional training, as a result of which they became leaders, shamans, and so on. That is, they were part of the sphere of governance, the reality is such, and how does the situation stand concerning the selection of our governors?
Ну, не по снам это точно.
Not on the basis of dreams, that's for sure. And in fact, the question of the consistency of a governor is not resolved in any way. There are no intelligible criteria. How our governors become governors, this is another theme. The reality is that the method of dynamic programming and the pictures connected with it are, after all, those images, those hieroglyphs, in which the sufficiently general theory of governance and the entire function of governance are captured. And, accordingly, whatever you like, on the basis of words or images of this kind, the sufficiently general theory of governance can always be unfolded with the necessary degree of detailedness and elaboration as a sufficiently general theory of governance. That is, an abstraction, or it can be unfolded in the concrete application of solving these or those tasks. But you need to know the sufficiently general theory of governance, both in the aspect of lexicon and in the aspect of hieroglyphics, because if, again, we correlate with the metaphor of the tree of knowledge as a metaphor for all scientific activity, then now it is proposed to jump from branch to branch when solving complex interdisciplinary tasks and projects. But in order to solve such interdisciplinary tasks and implement complex projects covering many applied branches of science, it is required to go, every time, on the path from objective reality to the rune of the tree of cognition. And the trunk, in any case, is the sufficiently general theory of governance, which, in some form, also contains the methodology of cognition. Why? Because any governance can be implemented on the basis of three schemes. If we turn to this picture, then the variant program governance is possible. In program governance, there are no feedback lines. The governorial signal that goes along the chains of feed-forward lines, in this case, is a function of time. That is, in the system of governance, there is a timer, and the timer works. If it works properly, then a governorial signal is given out. And the executive mechanisms in the object work. Is it good or bad? It depends on the task being solved, because in some cases, the program scheme of governance, without any feedback lines, allows you to successfully solve many tasks without being preoccupied with organizing feedback lines, simplifying both the process of governance and the construction of an enclosed system. But if the conditions for which the program is intended do not correspond to reality, then the program will cause a lot of trouble. There may be funny examples. For example, a ship modeling competition, a programmed missile boat. Objective: go the distance, that is, hit the target at the finish line and shoot with 4 missiles. The boat takes a position, something happens to the engine, as a result of which the boat stops. But the program does not know that the engine has stopped. There are no feedback lines. The program continues to work. The wind turns the boat towards the table at which the judges are sitting. And at this moment, the timer issues a command for a missile salvo. The first missile passes over the heads of the judges. When the fourth missile is launched, all the judges are under the table. This is an example of a program running in inappropriate conditions. Another scheme of governance is program adaptive. There are feed-forward lines. There are also feedback lines. Feedback lines provide information about the state of the environment and the state of the object. But the law, that is the algorithm on the basis of which the governorial decision, the governorial signal, is worked out, it remains unchanged. But since information about the state of the environment and about the object is applied to the system of governance, the program of governance adapts to the concretics of conditions in which it's implemented. And therefore, it is implemented adequately to the circumstances. However, if we talk about the quality of governance, then program adaptive schemes of governance have their limits. Why? Firstly, all the senses from which the information is taken have thresholds of perception. Information through feedback lines travels at a finite speed. The system of governance needs time to work out governorial decisions. The decision also needs time to travel along the chains of feed-forward lines. The executive mechanisms need time in order to operate the governorial decision. And, as a result, it turns out that even with ideal governance, which, with instantaneous performance speed and zero sensitivity thresholds of senses, could fully ensure that they fall into the ideal mode, even with such ideal governance, the object anyway turns out to be under a non-zero disturbing impact. And, because of this circumstance, the error of governance is also not always zero. And the conditions may be such that this error of governance is acceptable. Well, okay. And what if it's not acceptable? Then what to do?
Менять сигнал управляющий.
Then it turns out that if the capacities of the executive bodies that implement the governorial decision are sufficient, then it would be desirable that they begin to act, not after the senses have registered that the system has left the ideal mode, but in anticipation of the impact of the environment and the exit of the system. It turns out that this scheme of governance is also possible, and it is called the predictor-corrector. In the predictor-corrector scheme, the governing impact is not only a function of what has actually already happened, but it's also a certain function of prognosing, that is, of what has not yet happened. And, thanks to the fact that the governing impact is based on the prognosis, governance can even be proactive in relation to the disturbance of the environment. On account of this, with the same capacities of the executive bodies and the system as a whole, with the same provision of resources, the quality of governance can be significantly increased, and the required capacities, and accordingly, the consumption of resources can be reduced. The predictor-corrector scheme can be implemented on intellectless carriers, simply when the irregularities of prognostics are inserted into the system of governance and operated in the process of working out a governorial decision in an automatic mode. But the highest variant of the predictor-corrector scheme is an intellectual scheme of governance that implements the entire function of governance in the process of governance itself. And for the intellectual scheme of governance to work, intellect is required. If this is human intellect, then, accordingly, ethics should be such that God does not deny man distinction, and it's necessary to master dialectics as an instrument of cognition and creativity, including the implementation of prognostics in the process of working out a governorial decision, and, accordingly, in the process of perfecting the methodology of prognostics. And it turns out that if a person masters dialectics as an instrument of cognition, then, in this way, he in some form also masters the sufficiently general theory of governance. And the implementation of the concretics of governance is not a problem for him by strength of the fact that he possesses dialectics. In other words, he can skip this stage, the working out of the sufficiently general theory of governance in his personal version, and immediately move to solving governorial tasks in their concretics, since he implements the entire function of governance in its intellectual form in the predictor-corrector scheme based on the mastery of dialectics. If he masters the sufficiently general theory of governance, and it presupposes the implementation of the entire function of governance, and, accordingly, the solution of tasks of the stability of an object in terms of predictability of behavior, then, in some form, he must also master the art of dialectics, perhaps without formalizing it in some lexicon for himself, creating his own philosophical system, but simply successfully solving. Why? Because, in the end, it all comes down to the phrase from the movie, Shogun. Mr. Taranaga is very smart, he rarely makes mistakes. Rarely makes mistakes in practice. It is he who successfully implements his intentions. That is, he is an effective governor. And the criteria that were put in the selection of governorial cadres at the beginning of Perestroika. Comrade Gorbachev is very smart, he talks about everything without a piece of paper. These are not the criteria that enable one to successfully implement political projects and form these political projects. On this, we are finished with the sufficiently general theory of governance. I told you about it somewhat differently from the order in which it's presented in publications, in books. But, nonetheless, the main thing was said, and it was shown that this is not only an abstraction, but has very organic connections with life, including in those aspects over which, in the preponderance of cases, we do not ponder. But if we stand on the positions of the sufficiently general theory of governance, then the psyche of every one of us is an informational algorithmic system which must be governed, including governance towards the processes of its perfecting. The life of society is also an object of governance. And, in general, any process can be interpreted as a process of governance or self-governance, flowing in the stream of encompassing processes, which, in turn, are also either processes of self-governance or of hierarchically higher governance.